All right, so the last lesson in chapter 12 is about parks and protected areas. So now we're getting into how governments and other organizations are protecting the land. That way we don't continue to lose it. So back in 1872, the United States' first national park was created because people were realizing that the American West, so over here, there were lots of beautiful parts of nature, and they wanted to preserve them for nature appreciation and recreation. So the first national park ever was Yellowstone. Then the others followed, like Sequoia National Park, General Grant National Park, which is now Kings Canyon National Park, Yosemite, Mount Rainier, and Crater Lake National Park in Oregon. And that's what that image is of right there. The Antiquities Act of 1906 gave the president authority to declare selected public lands as national monuments, which may later have led them being turned into national parks. So in order to take care of all these national parks and monuments, the National Park Service was established in 1916 to look over and administer the 408 total national parks and monuments. And these parks receive over 280 million reported visitors, recreation visitors a year, which is about one per person in the United States, which is pretty crazy. So this is Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and this is Arches National Park in Utah. So there's another type of protected land called a National Wildlife Refuge, which are meant to be havens for wildlife. So they were started in 1903 by Theodore Roosevelt, and now there's over 590 refuges. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service takes care of them, and they allow for non-commercial hunting, fishing, photography, and environmental education are encouraged at all refuges. And they pretty much exist within an easy drive of every major American city, so there are a lot of these around to see and do. One thing that's interesting to note is that hunting, non-commercial hunting, like recreational hunting, is allowed and encouraged within these national wildlife refuges as long as it is within the correct season and you have a permit and things like that. So wilderness areas are another type of land, and they were allowed in 1964 when the U.S. Congress passed the Wilderness Act, allowing for some federal areas to be designated as wilderness areas. And this was in response to the public's desire for undeveloped land. These areas are off limits to development, but they're open to other recreational activities like hiking and low-impact recreation. Congress established this because they said that these lands were needed to assure that an increasing population accompanied by expanding settlement and growing mechanization does not occupy and modify all areas, leaving no lands designated for preservation and protection in their natural condition. So basically, as we're growing and taking over more land, we need to make sure that we're maintaining some natural land. These wilderness areas are established within national forests, national parks, national wildlife refuges, and land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. So now we get to the opposite side. So the reason why not all land is protected is because a lot of people don't support setting land aside if there's other interests at play. So when a lot of the western states came into existence, the federal government retained control over much of their acreage. For example, Idaho, Oregon, and Utah controlled less than half of their own land. And I think that Nevada, something like 80% of its land is protected by, or is federally managed. So these independent sovereign states, sovereign's probably the wrong word, these independent states that have control over their own land for a lot of things based on the Constitution, they can't control them because they're in, under government control. And a lot of state governments want to gain control over their land and allow them to be used for resource extraction. So it comes back to money, come back to the economy. If we're allowed to use them for resource extraction like timber or minerals or anything like that, then now we're bringing in jobs and we're bringing in money into our state economy. It's also, they want to allow things like recreational activities that disturb wildlife, such as snowmobiling or jet skiing. If there's a protected land that doesn't allow that, then that's another industry or another recreational that's not allowed. And for example, in East Africa, the thing that this chapter keeps talking about is people living near the Serengeti National Park. They want a road there to allow them for better mobility and access to trade, but that would cut through a national park, so it doesn't exist. And a lot of parks bring ecotourism, so it does provide jobs for a lot of people, but people who work in other industries say that then they aren't able to have their industry set there. Also, parks may be opposed by indigenous people. So the example that they give is that Native Americans, who had most of their land taken away by the government anyways, have a Devil's Tower National Monument is in Wyoming, and it's a sacred place for them, but it's also a really good spot for rock climbing. So they have trouble with that because they see it as desecration when these people are climbing on their sacred monument. So the compromise there is that the government decided that you cannot climb on the monument in June, which is when Native Americans go there for religious ceremonies. So they did come up with a compromise for that. But on the flip side of that, some indigenous peoples that live in these parks are protected because they live within the park. So they're protected from, their land is safe from conflict with industry. So other miners or loggers or anything like that would want to come in and take their land, they can't because it's within a national or federally managed land. So there's a lot of different groups that manage and protect the land. Each U.S. state has agencies that manage public land, as do counties and municipalities. Nearly 7,000 state parks are found across the United States. The state parks first came into existence when a place, which was the second ever national park called Mackinac Island, is in Michigan, and it was transferred to the state of Michigan, making it the first officially designated state park. Then there's also organizations that are private and nonprofit groups that could purchase land for preservation, and these organizations are called land trusts. So some of these examples are California's Big Sur, Jackson Hole in Wyoming, and Maine's Mount Desert Island. So those are protected by private organizations. Across the world, parks and reserves are increasing. Worldwide area in protected parks and reserves has increased nearly 7-fold since 1970. So now it covers almost 13% of the world's land area. However, parks in developing countries often do not have the funding that they need to protect them from poaching, manage the resources, and provide for the recreation that happens there. So they're known as what's called paper parks, meaning that they're protected on paper, but not in reality. The land is used as anyone around sees fit instead of under the regulations that were set. Then we also have the UN, who has established protected areas called biosphere reserves that have exceptional levels of biodiversity and benefit local people. So if the UN sees a spot that has a lot of biodiversity and benefits the people around it, they would create a biosphere reserve. Biosphere reserves contain 3 zones, each of which has different limits on how the land can be used. So they're still allowing for land to be used while still trying to protect the biodiversity. So here's an image of the 3 different zones. There's the core zone, the core area, the buffer zone, and the transition zone. The core area is the area that protects biodiversity, so that's the super regulated part. Outside of that is the buffer zone, where it allows for local activities and limited development. So for the people that were already there, they're allowed to do a little bit of development. And then the outer zone, the transition zone, is where agriculture, human settlement, and other land uses are pursued sustainably. So they're still allowing for local interests to happen, but sustainably. An example of this would be the Mayo Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala. And what happens there is that inside, in the core area, is the rainforest. And outside, there is timber harvesting takes place due to concessions. So concessions are happening there, meaning that other countries are paying to harvest timber there sustainably. The UN has also designated World Heritage Sites, which have special natural or cultural values and span the borders of multiple countries. So this might not have to do with biodiversity or conservation per se, but it has a special cultural or natural value. An example here is a mountain gorilla reserve that takes land from Rwanda, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and is helping preserve the mountain gorilla there. So it crosses borders there. So sometimes these are known as what's called peace parks because they help to ease tensions by acting as buffers between nations with historical boundary disputes. Then sometimes economic incentives can help preserve land, so it always comes back to money. So there's some, the first way that we learned about this was conservation concessions, where an organization would give money in return for protected land. An international organization. Another one is what's called a debt to nature swap. We're an organization that raised money to pay off a developing nation's international debt in exchange for setting aside land as reserve. So let's say pay off a nation's debt, so settling some of their debt in exchange for them preserving land. So an example of this is that the U.S. Actually forgave $30 million in debt to Indonesia. So Indonesia owed us $30 million. We forgave that debt, said you don't owe us that money anymore as long as you preserve the forested areas that are home to the Sumatran tiger, which is an endangered species. So they need to set aside the land, they need to fund environmental education, and better manage the protected areas in exchange for the forgiving of the debt. So habitat fragmentation makes preserves more vital, so more necessary, it's saying. So habitat fragmentation is when expanding agriculture, cities, highways, and logging can divide up large areas of habitat into small, disconnected ones. So it may look like the whole piece of protected land is still there, but it's actually split up by roads or a building or anything like that. And forests are being fragmented because of logging, agriculture, and residential development. And so even where forests are regrowing, like we're seeing that secondary forest growth that's coming back, we have more land area that are forests, the forests are becoming fragmented into smaller pieces, so it's not one whole piece of land anymore. And this is bad because when forests are fragmented, large species that need large areas of habitat may disappear. If we're looking at large species that roam over lots of land, now they can't do that anymore because they're blocked, and so they may go extinct or move to another place. And then other species may experience what's called edge effects, where the conditions along a fragment's edge differ from the conditions in the interior. So it might still be the same whole piece of land, but we put a road through it, and now that road has edges on it, and the conditions are there different. So for example, birds like the wood thrush, which is shown there, live near the edges of the habitats. They may be attacked by predators or parasites that favor open areas. So they're safe in the middle of the forest, but on the outside they're not as safe. And so that road or the edge effect is actually causing a big negative effect on them. Then we have what's called the island biogeography theory. And so we can look at habitat fragments the same way we can look at islands, so we can learn a lot from what happens on islands to them. So this theory explains how the number of species on an island is the result of balance between immigration of new species and loss of others through extirpation. So either new species are coming in through immigration or species is going extinct on that one particular place. So there's a balance there of how many species there are. So the theory predicts an island's species richness based on its size and distance from the mainland. So there's three parts to this. The first one is that the further an island is from a continent, the fewer species tend to colonize it. And the reason for that is because there's just lower immigration rates. It's easier for species to get to the small island than to a further island. Then also, larger islands tend to have higher immigration rates. And the reason for that is because there's just a greater land area for birds to accidentally come across, or any kind of species. So more species will colonize larger islands. And lastly, it says proportionately fewer species go extinct on larger islands. Larger islands have lower extinction rates because their population sizes are larger. They're just less likely to go extinct by a random event. So the overall moral of this is that large islands tend to have more species, and also they probably tend to have more different kinds of habitats, which in turn can house more species. And so we can apply these through to the islands of forests that are left through fragmentation. So we can think of the islands, the pieces of forest that have been fragmented as islands, and apply this. So the larger the habitat fragment is, the more likely that we're able to house more species there. And so reserve design has consequences for biodiversity. So basically, when we're trying to create reserves for forests or for different species, conservationists are unsure if it's better to make the reserves large in size and have fewer of them, or smaller in size and have have more of them. It's called SLOSS, the single large or several small debate. There's ups and downs. Large species that roam great distances benefit the most from larger reserves. They need that extra space. Whereas smaller organisms like insects can thrive in smaller areas and are better helped by having a wide variety of habitats protected. So it's a give and take there. They're also considering what's called corridors, which is connecting to habitat fragments to create, to help make it seem like it's a larger one. And there's a good picture in your book of a corridor of land going across a freeway in Canada. So that way the larger animals can still cross, and they're not as affected by the freeway cutting through the forest.